Imagine standing ankle-deep in dirty floodwater as rain hammers your roof, your phone vibrating with emergency alerts, your children asking if the water will rise higher this time, and somewhere far away, in an air-conditioned office, someone is signing off on a project that was supposed to protect you but never existed. Because this story is not just about floods, it's about power, money, betrayal, and a system that learned how to profit from disaster itself. And if you stay with me until the end, you will understand how a nation built on hope became trapped in a cycle where suffering is budgeted, fear is monetized, and corruption hides behind concrete that was never poured. Because the flood control scandal in the Philippines is not an isolated crime, it is a mirror held up to modern governance everywhere, including here in the United States, and once you see how it works, you can't unsee it. So before we begin, I want you to do one thing: hit subscribe, because this is not just a documentary, it's a warning, and what you're about to hear will change the way you look at government promises forever. Now let's go back, far before the headlines, before the Senate hearings, before the viral photos of broken dikes and submerged villages, back to a country shaped by water, where typhoons are not rare events but seasonal certainties, where floods are written into history books, lullabies, and survival instincts, because the Philippines sits in the path of the Pacific's most violent storms, averaging more than 20 typhoons a year, and for decades, flood control has been framed as a matter of life and death, a moral obligation of the state, and also, quietly, a gold mine, because where there is fear, there is funding, and where there is funding, there is opportunity, especially when oversight is weak and accountability is optional. And this is where the story begins to twist, because after World War II, as the Philippines rebuilt its cities and infrastructure, flood control projects became symbols of progress. Dams, levees, river walls, drainage systems all promised safety, modernization, stability, and every administration pledged to fix flooding once and for all. But the floods kept coming year after year, president after president, budget after budget, and somewhere along the way, a dangerous question stopped being asked. Why? Because if billions of dollars had already been spent, why were communities still drowning? And the uncomfortable answer is this: because the system was never designed to solve the problem, it was designed to manage it, to keep it just bad enough to justify more money, more projects, more contracts, more ribbon cuttings, more photo ops, and more opportunities to siphon public funds into private pockets. And to understand how this became possible, you have to understand how flood control money moves, because on paper it looks clean. Funds are allocated by Congress, released to government agencies, passed down to regional offices, then awarded to contractors through bidding processes that are supposed to ensure transparency. But in reality, the paper trail becomes a maze, budgets are inflated, scopes of work are vague, projects are split into smaller pieces to avoid scrutiny, contractors are pre-selected, bids are rigged, and inspections are reduced to rubber stamps, and by the time the money reaches the ground, if it ever does, most of it is already gone. And this is not a theory, it's a pattern that auditors, journalists, and whistleblowers have been pointing out for decades. But the scandal exploded into public consciousness only recently, when the scale became impossible to ignore, when communities started documenting projects that existed only in spreadsheets, when satellite images showed empty riverbanks where walls were supposed to stand, when residents realized that the concrete barriers meant to protect them had the structural integrity of cardboard, and when senators, under public pressure, began asking questions they had avoided for years, and what they found was staggering: hundreds of flood control projects listed as completed, fully paid, officially closed, that were either unfinished, unusable, or never built at all, so-called ghost projects. Billions of pesos evaporated. And here's where the tension deepens, because corruption stories often focus on greedy individuals, a bad official here, a crooked contractor there. But this scandal revealed something much darker: a system-wide collaboration where politicians, bureaucrats, engineers, and private companies all played their roles, each benefiting just enough to stay silent. And this is why accountability is so rare, because exposing one person threatens everyone connected to them. And suddenly the story is no longer about missing flood walls, it's about how power protects itself, how investigations stall, how witnesses recant, how cases drag on for years until the public moves on, distracted by the next disaster, the next outrage, the next storm. And the storms keep coming, typhoon after typhoon, homes destroyed, lives lost, families displaced, and every time, the same officials stand before cameras promising reforms, promising transparency, promising that lessons have been learned, and yet the cycle repeats because disaster has become normalized, and normalization is corruption's best friend. And if you're watching this from the United States, you might think this is a distant problem, a developing world issue, but listen closely because the mechanics are universal: infrastructure spending, emergency budgets, complex contracts, limited oversight, political patronage. These are not uniquely Filipino problems, they exist everywhere. And the Philippines is simply an extreme case study of what happens when these forces collide in a country exposed to constant natural disasters. And the emotional core of this story lies with the people who pay the price. Not in abstract numbers, but in lived experience. Farmers who lose entire harvests because drainage canals were never cleared. Urban families trapped on rooftops because pumping stations never worked. Children wading through contaminated water because river walls collapsed under pressure they were never designed to withstand. And imagine the psychological toll of knowing that your suffering was preventable, that money meant to protect you was stolen, that your fear was profitable to someone else. And this is where outrage turns into something deeper, a sense of betrayal, because governments exist to protect their people, and flood control is one of the most basic expressions of that responsibility. And when it fails not because of nature, but because of greed, the social contract itself begins to crack. And yet, for years, the scandal remained fragmented, hidden in audit reports no one read, buried in local news stories that never crossed borders, until social media changed the equation, because suddenly, residents could document broken projects in real time, compare official reports with on-the-ground reality, and share evidence faster than authorities could suppress it. And once the images went viral, senators could no longer look away. Hearings were called, names were mentioned, contractors were summoned, and for a moment, it seemed like the system might finally be held to account. But this is where the story becomes complicated. Because investigations are not convictions, hearings are not justice, and public anger does not always translate into reform. Especially when powerful interests are at stake. And what followed was a familiar pattern: denials, counter-accusations, procedural delays, and a narrative battle over who was really responsible. Was it poor planning, bureaucratic inefficiency, local government failures, or outright corruption? And while these debates played out, the floods continued, because nature does not wait for legal clarity. And this raises a haunting question: how many disasters does it take before corruption is treated as an emergency? Because the damage caused by stolen flood control funds is not hypothetical, it is measurable in deaths, in displacement, in economic loss, and in trauma. And yet, corruption is often framed as a victimless crime, a line item on a balance sheet, when in reality it is a form of violence, slow, invisible, but devastating. And this is why the flood control scandal matters far beyond the Philippines, because it forces us to confront how modern societies manage risk, how they allocate resources, and how easily noble goals like disaster prevention can be weaponized for personal gain. And if you think this story ends with arrests and reforms, think again, because history suggests otherwise. Past corruption scandals in the Philippines have followed a predictable arc: public outrage, political theater, limited accountability, and gradual amnesia. And the danger now is that this scandal will become just another chapter, another cautionary tale that fails to change the underlying system. And this is where the payoff of this documentary lies, not in naming villains, but in exposing patterns, because once you see how the incentives are structured, you understand why the problem persists. Politicians gain visibility and funds through large infrastructure projects. Contractors profit from inflated budgets. Bureaucrats benefit from discretion and opacity. And the public, fragmented and distracted, struggles to maintain sustained pressure. And floods, tragically, provide the perfect cover, because they can always be blamed on nature, climate change, or unprecedented rainfall. And while those factors are real, they are also convenient excuses, masking the fact that effective flood control does work when it is honestly implemented. And there are examples, even within the Philippines, of communities protected by well-designed, well-maintained systems, proving that the problem is not capability but integrity. And this is where the emotional tension tightens, because if solutions exist, then continued suffering is not inevitable, it is chosen, and that choice is made every time oversight is weakened, every time a whistleblower is ignored, every time a corrupt deal is rationalized as business as usual. And for American viewers, this should sound uncomfortably familiar, because infrastructure spending, disaster relief, and climate adaptation are massive topics in the United States as well, involving trillions of dollars, complex agencies, and powerful contractors. And the Philippine flood control scandal is a preview of what happens when vigilance fades, when transparency becomes a slogan instead of a practice, and when accountability is sacrificed for political convenience. And as this documentary unfolds, you'll see how corruption adapts, how it learns to survive reforms, how it hides behind technical language and bureaucratic complexity, and how it ultimately depends on one thing above all else: silence. because corruption does not thrive in darkness alone, it thrives in indifference, and this is why telling this story matters, because awareness is the first step toward accountability, and accountability is the only thing that breaks the cycle. And now, as we stand at this moment, with climate change intensifying, storms, sea levels rising, and vulnerable populations growing, the stakes could not be higher. Flood control is no longer just about protecting property. It's about safeguarding lives in an era of escalating risk, and every dollar stolen today multiplies tomorrow's disaster. And so the question is not whether the Philippines will face another flood. It will. The question is whether the next flood will once again expose empty promises and missing walls, or whether this scandal will finally force a reckoning. And that is the open loop we leave you with, because this story is still unfolding. The investigations are ongoing, the consequences uncertain, and the outcome will reveal not just the fate of a nation's infrastructure, but the moral limits of its political system. And perhaps, if we're paying attention, it will also teach us something about our own, because the real danger is not the water rising, it's the standards falling. And if you want to understand how societies drown not just in floods but in corruption, stay with us, because this is the story of how disaster became a business, how protection became a lie, and how the cost of corruption is always paid by those with the least power to avoid it. And once you see the full picture, you'll never look at a flood or a government promise the same way again.